What was the moment that made you decide to give up on the person you love? The moment I decided to stop loving Andrew. The first real cold rain of autumn was falling over New York. I stood beneath an umbrella on the corner across from his apartment building, rainwater dripping from the edge in silver beads, one after another onto the toes of my canvas sneakers. Through the curtain of rain, I watched him walk a woman to the door. The porch light above them glowed a tired yellow, turning the rain into the fragile wings of moths. He bent down and kissed her forehead. It was the gentlest kiss, light as a butterfly landing on a flower petal, carrying a kind of reverence I had never once seen in him before. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he adjusted her scarf, his fingers brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was slow, effortless, practiced as if he had done it 1,000 times already. Afterward, he stepped back, slid his hands into his pockets, and watched her climb into a cab. He stayed there until the taillights disappeared around the corner before turning and walking back inside. The entire time, he never once looked across the street. He didn't know I was standing there. Didn't know the pumpkin pie in my arms was still warm from the oven. The heat seeped through the cardboard box into my palms. But inside me, something cooled in that exact moment swiftly, irreversibly. It wasn't heartbreak in the dramatic sense. Nothing shattered. Nothing collapsed. It felt more like a stone I had carried for years finally, sinking to the bottom of a lake, quietly, without even a splash. And I remember thinking, okay, this is where it ends. Let me start from the beginning. I met Andrew Cross 4 years earlier, in September. I had just moved from a tiny Saltwind town in Maine into a freshman dorm at New York University. The city felt enormous, like some roaring steel beast. And I moved through it small and tense. Every nerve in my body braced, terrified someone would realize I didn't belong there. During the first week of classes, I wandered into a used bookstore in Greenwich Village called Left Bank to buy textbooks. It was squeezed between a laundromat and a pizza place, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Inside though, it opened into another world, towering shelves that required ladders, air thick with the faint bitter scent of aging paper. I was standing in the poetry aisle, stretching onto my toes to reach a copy of the selected poems of Frank O'Hara, when a hand appeared beside me and effortlessly pulled the book down. You like Frank O'Hara too? I turned and found a pair of gray-blue eyes smiling at me. He wore a faded dark green hoodie with the sleeves pushed to his forearms, exposing elegant hands and sharp wrist bones. His dark brown hair curled naturally at the edges, messy behind his ears. He stood half-shadowed by the poetry shelves, his profile clean and sculptural like something from a Greek statue. But his expression was soft, so soft it felt like he had known me forever. I nodded, struggling even to say thank you. My heart skipped for no reason at all. I'm Andrew, he said, turning the book in his own hands so I could see the cover Eliot's for quartets. You read poetry? A little, I replied. The truth was, it had been much more than a little. During those endless Maine winters, poetry had been my only escape route. Then we should talk, he said, smiling. A faint dimple appeared in his left cheek. I'm desperately in need of someone who can talk about O'Hara. And just like that, I fell into a long, sweet abyss. Andrew studied photography at Parsons. I majored in comparative literature. We became the kind of best friends that made other people visibly irritated with how obviously we blurred the line. He would text me things like, "The light today is too beautiful not to photograph you," and I would immediately put on my favorite dress and let him drag me to the High Line for an entire afternoon. Whenever he lifted the camera, his expression changed, completely focused and intent, like a hunter aiming at something elusive, or a child staring at something precious he couldn't fully understand. After the shutter clicks, he would always turn the camera screen toward me and say shyly, almost wonderingly, "Sylvie, look. Isn't this beautiful?" He always called me Sylvie. My full name was Sylvia, but from the very beginning he shortened it naturally, as though the nickname had belonged to him long before it belonged to me. Later, I read the letters between Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes and discovered Hughes had called her Sylvie too. The realization twisted something sweet and painful inside me for days. I never told Andrew that. I was afraid that if I did, all the blazing little secrets I carried for him would spill out with it. We spent countless afternoons like that together. By Bethesda Fountain in Central Park, he taught me how to identify clouds. On the Brooklyn Bridge, we challenged each other to spot the tiniest tugboat on the river. At the Met, he once stood staring at a hopper, painting for 20 minutes while I stood behind him pretending to study the art, when really I was studying the outline of light along the back of his neck. One winter evening, he slipped while sketching at an ice rink and lost one of his gloves. I peeled off my left glove and shoved it into his hand. He looked down at it, then at me, white breath dissolving into the night air. Gently, he brushed a fleck of ice from my coat and murmured, "Sylvie, what would I do without you?" He said things like that all the time. When I helped organize his first photography exhibit. When I stayed up all night helping him develop film in the darkroom. When he had a fever of 102 and I brought chicken soup to his apartment. Every single time, I would silently answer in my head, "Then let me stay." But I never said it aloud, because after every pause, he would always add brightly, almost carelessly, "You're my best friend." Those 5 words worked like a spell. Every time, they sealed shut the melting sugar lodged in my throat. And yet, he was so good to me. Good enough that I kept lying to myself. One Thanksgiving, he brought me home to Connecticut. Over dinner, his mother looked me up and down with an amused smile and asked, "Andrew, is this your girlfriend?" Without looking up from carving the turkey, he answered, "Nope, Mom, this is Sylvie. My Sylvie." The way he said my so casual, so unthinking sent my heart racing through the rest of dinner. That night, lying awake in the guest room across the hall, I overheard him talking to his younger brother. Somewhere between the muffled laughter, I caught the sentence, "She's really just a friend." I pulled the blanket over my head and spent the entire night chewing on those words. In the spring of sophomore year, Andrew held his first gallery show in a tiny East Village space. The opening was crowded, chaotic. I spent the whole evening greeting guests, handing out flyers, refilling flower vases, running myself breathless. When the last guests finally drifted out, he walked over to me and suddenly wrapped both arms tightly around me. His chin rested lightly on top of my head. I could feel the long, exhausted breath leaving his chest. "We did it," he murmured. "Sylvie, I couldn't have done this without you." I closed my eyes and rested my face against his chest. His hoodie smelled faintly of darkroom chemicals and sweet laundry detergent. In that moment, I truly believed everything was moving in the direction I had hoped for. I thought there was only a thin sheet of paper between us, something that could be pierced with the gentlest touch, letting all the light rush through. In the end, that paper was pierced by a woman named Claire, only she pierced it from the other side cleanly, decisively, leaving scraps of paper drifting everywhere. Claire was an assistant curator at a gallery on the Upper West Side. Tall, honey-skinned, with sleek black hair tucked close to her jawline. When she smiled, she carried the kind of effortless elegance that made it seem like she had already mastered every room she walked into. Andrew met her at an opening reception, and afterward, the first time he mentioned her name to me, there was something in his voice I had never heard before. A careful trembling, like the first flame catching dry wood. "She understands photography," he told me. Like, really understands it. She talked to me about Cartier-Bresson's decisive moment, Stephen Shore. And she said her favorite photo of mine was the one I took at Grand Central. "Sylvie, you'd love her." I smiled and said, "Sounds wonderful." Inside me, a tiny clock stopped ticking forever. Eventually, I met her. That weekend, they invited me to Union Square's farmers market. Andrew insisted I come. He said he wanted Claire to meet his most important friend. I stood beside a stand selling organic honey and watched. Claire slip her arm through Andrew's so naturally, so comfortably, as though she had been doing it her entire life. Andrew looked down at her, and there was a brightness in his eyes unlike anything I had ever seen before. Not almost unlike, not slightly unlike, entirely unlike. I had never seen him look at me that way. What followed felt like watching a car crash in slow motion. I watched him switch to the kind of coffee Claire liked. I watched his phone wallpaper become a photo of the two of them. I watched him abandon our Sunday brunch ritual because Claire had yoga classes uptown. And through all of it, I continued playing the flawless role of best friend. I listened to him ramble over the phone about how special Claire was. I helped him choose shirts for their first real date. I even went to his apartment one evening to help him prepare a homemade dinner for her. I remember that afternoon perfectly. His apartment windows faced west, and autumn sunlight poured through them sideways, drenching the living room in honey-colored light. I spread a clean tablecloth across the table, lit brass candlesticks we'd once found at a flea market, arranged white tulips carefully into a glass vase one stem at a time. Andrew leaned out from the kitchen. Tomato sauce splattered across his apron. His hair a complete disaster, and grinned at me. "Sylvie," he asked, "do girls actually like this kind of thing?" "Yes," I said. My voice was smooth and still as a frozen river. "She'll love it." He let out a triumphant cheer and disappeared back into the kitchen. I stood there staring at the beautifully set table, the candles, the flowers, the two carefully arranged place settings, and suddenly felt like someone who builds a stage only to disappear behind the curtain. The spotlight would never fall on me. The applause would never belong to me. That night, I curled up alone in my apartment with the cheapest bottle of red wine I could find and drank glass after glass in front of a television I never turned on. At one point, my phone lit up. A text from Andrew. "Tonight was perfect. She agreed to be my girlfriend." I replied, "I'm so happy for you." After sending it, I turned my phone face down on the floor and sat there for a very long time without moving. I don't even know when I started crying. Hairs slipped into the corners of my mouth, salty against the bitterness of cheap wine. And even then, I still couldn't make myself give up. That's the terrifying thing about unrequited love. It twists logic into something grotesque. I started telling myself they were only new, that maybe they wouldn't last. Maybe eventually he would come back to me. Surely all those years together, all those shimmering little moments between us couldn't possibly mean nothing. He had said, "What would I do without you?" That couldn't have been fate. I became a gambler, pushing every last chip onto the words "maybe someday." Every loss only made me bet harder. The more I lost, the more desperately I stayed at the table. Then came the winter of junior year. Andrew and Claire had their first serious fight. Around 1 in the morning, he called me. His voice sounded rough and exhausted as he asked if we could meet. I threw on my coat without hesitation and ran out into the freezing night. I found him sitting beneath the Washington Square arch, his coat hanging open, ears red from the cold. I hurried over, unwound my scarf, and wrapped it around his neck. He looked up at me, eyes damp and fragile beneath the streetlights. "Sylvie," he asked quietly, "if someone always makes you feel like you're not enough, should you let them go?" My heart nearly burst out of my chest. I sat beside him, our shoulders touching in the brutal December wind, choosing every word with agonizing care. I was terrified of sounding selfish. Terrified he would hear hope in my voice if I encouraged him to leave her. So all I said was, "You shouldn't have to become someone else for love." He stayed silent for a long time. Then slowly, he leaned over and rested his head against my shoulder. The instant that weight settled against me, my whole body locked still. Somewhere across the square, pigeons cooed softly, our breath tangled together in white clouds. His hair brushed against my neck, warm, feather-light, unbearably intimate. And I thought, this has to be it. This has to be the sign I've been waiting for. The strange thing was, I didn't cry. Not right away. There was no cinematic collapse. No trembling breakdown in the middle of the street. No tragic soundtrack swelling behind me while New York blurred into streaks of light. There was only exhaustion. A deep, ancient kind of exhaustion. Like I had spent 4 years holding. A door opened for someone who had never intended to walk through it. The next afternoon, Claire showed up at his apartment carrying a box of his favorite chocolate hazelnut cookies. He kissed her forehead at the door and apologized to her. By evening, I got one of Andrew's group texts. "Claire and I made up. Thanks for checking in, everyone." I stared at the message while sitting on the edge of my bed, feeling as though someone had shoved my entire body into cold water. My ears rang. That night, I deleted the half-finished confession. I'd been drafting in my notes app for months, but I still didn't delete him. I wasn't ready. I still loved him too much. After that, things unfolded the way water slowly wears down a loosened stone little by little. Day after day, pushing me toward the moment when everything would finally give way. He forgot my 22nd birthday. I had curled my hair that morning, worn a new dress, made reservations at the little Italian restaurant. In the East Village we'd always talked about trying. He promised he'd meet me at 7. At 7:15, my phone buzzed. Claire suddenly wanted to drive out to the Hamptons for sunrise tomorrow. So I'm already on the road. "Happy birthday, Sylvie. I'll make it up to you when I'm back." I sat alone at the window table, ordered pasta, and ate slowly for 40 minutes. Then I walked home by myself, opened the cake box on my kitchen counter, cut a slice, and ate it in silence. The frosting was too sweet. Other friends texted throughout the night. I replied to every single one, except him, and still even after that I couldn't let go. I made excuses for him the way people build tiny shelters out of denial. They were still in the honeymoon phase. Of course he was distracted. I mattered to him too. Timing was the problem. Claire had simply gotten there first. That was all. Just timing. Just circumstances. Just me refusing to wake up. Until the night it rained. New York in November has a cold that sinks straight into your bones. That day was Andrew's 25th birthday. Claire was away in Los Angeles for work, and earlier that afternoon he texted me, "Guess I'm spending my birthday alone this year." There was a playful loneliness in it, almost pouty, and immediately, the dying little flame inside me flared back to life. I thought, maybe this is the moment. Maybe I didn't need to wait anymore. Maybe all I had to do was show up at his door holding his favorite pumpkin pie. And when he looked down at me, suddenly, he would understand everything. I went to the bakery near my apartment and picked out the best pumpkin pie they had. I asked the cashier to warm it up and wrap it carefully in foil before boxing it. When I stepped outside, the rain was still manageable. Halfway there, the sky opened. Rain came down in violent sheets. I held the umbrella in one hand and pressed the pie against my chest with the other, splashing through puddles while icy water seeped through my canvas, sneakers and soaked my socks. I never considered turning back. My heart was beating so hard it felt like a drum that had been gathering force for long years, finally preparing to strike its loudest note. I stopped across the street from his building, about to cross toward the entrance, and then the apartment door opened. Claire stepped out first. She was wearing his coat. Her hair was slightly messy. Andrew followed behind her holding an umbrella he never bothered to open, simply standing beneath the awning watching her. They didn't say much. He adjusted her scarf gently, then lowered his head and kissed her forehead. That kiss, so light it reminded me of a butterfly settling onto a flower petal, tender in a way I had never seen on his face before, reverent. And the expression he wore while watching her taxi disappear around the corner. It was as though the entire noise of the city had gone silent, leaving only her in the world. He stood there for a long time, so long that my fingers started going numb around the pie box. Then he turned and went back inside. He never looked across the street. He never saw me standing there. He never knew the pumpkin pie in my arms was slowly losing its warmth. I turned around and started walking home. The rain kept getting heavier. My umbrella stopped mattering after a while. Water slipped down my collar, freezing against my skin, yet somehow I felt feverishly hot inside. I crossed intersection after intersection without really thinking, and yet it felt as though I had somehow thought through an entire lifetime. I remembered the first autumn we met, the way he had looked down at me beside the poetry shelves. I remembered the warmth of his fingertips brushing dust from my eyelashes. I remembered all those nights we walked through empty streets shoulder to shoulder while I secretly studied his profile and rehearsed the same impossible hope again and again. I remembered what would I do without you. I remembered you're my best friend. I remembered the weight of his head resting against my shoulder beneath the Washington Square arch. And suddenly, all those years, all those tiny sacred moments was shattered by that single kiss in the rain. Not violently, not painfully, not even tragically, just, finally. I looked down at the pumpkin pie in my arms. The cardboard box had gone soft and crooked from the rain. At the corner, I stopped beside a trash can and gently placed it inside. And in the exact moment I let go, what I felt wasn't devastation. It wasn't the sharp agony of something being torn away. It was lightness. A strange, breathtaking lightness. As if the hands that had been clenched tight for 4 years had finally opened, and blood was rushing back into fingers gone numb from holding on too long. When I got home, I peeled off my soaked clothes and wrapped myself in a blanket on the floor. Water dripped from my hair, darkening the wood beneath me in small uneven circles. I picked up my phone and opened my camera roll. Starting with the newest photo, I began deleting him. Andrew standing in Central Park with a camera raised to his eye. Andrew making ridiculous faces in my scarf at Washington Square. Andrew in his parents' Connecticut kitchen, caught mid-laugh while shucking corn. Then finally, the very first picture. A photo I had secretly taken years ago in Left Bank. Books. He was sitting by the window reading Eliot. Sunlight turning his hair the color of honey. I stared at it for a very long time. Then I pressed delete. After that, I opened social media. Unfollow. Remove friend. Block suggestions. The motions were clean and calm. like unraveling an old sweater, no longer intended to finish knitting. Then I climbed into bed and closed my eyes. I thought I would cry until morning, but I didn't. I simply fell asleep deeply, peacefully, like a ship that had finally found shore after drifting for years. Nothing dramatic happened afterward. There was no cinematic blow-up, no triumphant reinvention montage. I just slowly began building a life that no longer revolved around him. I moved out of the East Village and rented a sunlit apartment in Brooklyn with enormous windows. I started painting again. Back in Maine, when I was little, I used to paint oceans and boats endlessly. Somewhere along the way, while chasing Andrew's orbit, I had abandoned it. When I picked up a brush again, my fingers felt stiff and uncertain. But there was also something deeply familiar about it. Like reuniting with an old friend you never truly stopped loving. I started sketching in parks, going to galleries alone, eating dinner alone, traveling alone. I met new people too. Some of them stirred something gentle in me. This time, I didn't run from it, but I also stopped treating every flicker of connection like a life raft. A full year later, I saw Andrew again. It happened at the Museum of Modern Art during the Hopper retrospective. He was standing alone in front of Nighthawks, hands buried in the pockets of his coat. He looked thinner than I remembered. I almost turned away, but then he looked up and saw me. Sylvie. There was surprise in his voice. And something else too, something cautious, almost fragile. I smiled politely and stopped. He stepped closer, leaving a careful, respectful distance between us. He told me he and Claire had broken up 3 months earlier. While he said it, he kept looking at me with an expression that felt part memory, part question. I realized later, he said quietly, there were a lot of things you never told me. I didn't answer, not because I had nothing to say, but because I suddenly realized all the words that once crowded my throat, desperate to spill out, no longer needed to belong to anyone else. They still existed. They had simply become mine. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee downstairs. After a brief hesitation, I agreed. We sat by the window and talked about ordinary things. Work, old friends, the weather, the fact that Left Bank Books had closed after the rent went up. When our cups were empty, we stood to leave. As always, he opened his arms and hugged me lightly. I patted his back, my heart beat smooth and still as a winter lake. Take care, Andrew. You too, Sylvie. Outside, late November sunlight stretched thinly across the streets. The air was cold and clean, clouds moving quickly overhead. I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and kept walking toward the subway station. It wasn't until I had gone several blocks that I realized something strange. I had never once turned around to look back at him, and at that realization, I smiled. I thought about the rainy night a year before, the pumpkin pie abandoned in the trash can, the girl walking away through the cold rain with her heart finally breaking open, instead of apart. Back then, I believed deciding to let Andrew go was the end of my love for him. Now I understand it was the beginning of loving myself again. We tend to think giving up on someone we deeply love means failure. That we didn't wait long enough, didn't love hard enough. So we tie ourselves tighter and tighter to a rope already cutting into our skin, whispering through the pain, just wait a little longer. Maybe this time he'll finally see me. But real love should never require you to become the girl standing across the street in the rain, clutching a cooling offering in her hands while waiting for a gaze that will never turn toward her. The night I let Andrew go, I didn't hate him. If anything, I was grateful. Grateful that he finally freed me with a kiss that was tender, sincere, and never meant for me. That decision wasn't surrender. It was clarity. It wasn't failure. It was survival. It was the moment I finally took all the light I had spent for years, pouring into someone else, and turned it back toward myself. Some departures are not about leaving another person behind. They are about gathering the shattered pieces of yourself, one by one, and carrying them home. That night, I lost Andrew, but I got Sylvie back. And in the end, that was enough.